Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine standing right there, watching this monumental figure, Moses, lead an entire nation out of slavery, and then you hear him say something like, yeah, this was big, but wait, there's someone else coming centuries from now who will really fulfill all this.
It's kind of mind-bending, isn't it? We're diving deep today into, well, a really stunning claim from ancient scripture. That Moses wasn't just the lawgiver, the great deliverer of Israel, but that his life was almost like a blueprint for Jesus. Was he just a historical giant, or was he deliberately designed, you could say, to foreshadow the ultimate prophet? That's what we're digging into. Yeah, and the bedrock for this whole idea, the source material, really zeroes in on one specific verse. It's Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. Moses is talking to the people, the ones he's just led through, all that time in the wilderness. And he tells them pretty directly, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him.
A prophet like me, that phrase is doing a lot of work there.
It really is. I mean, that's the absolute core of our investigation today. Why would Moses say that?
Yeah.
This is the guy who, tradition holds, spoke to God face to face, who brought down the Ten Commandments. Probably the most unique figure in their entire history up to that point. So why insist the next big one had to be modeled specifically after him? Our mission here is to kind of excavate these surprising connections, the structural arguments the source material brings forward, to see if we can uncover that intended link. We're looking at Moses not just historically, but as, well, an intentional foreshadowing.
Okay, and the time gap here is just, it's vast, right? We're talking,
Right.
Something like 1,400 years between Moses saying this and the time of Jesus.
Roughly, yeah. A huge span. But for the people right there listening to Moses, the context of when he said it is also really significant.
Right, because it wasn't just dropped into casual conversation. Didn't it come right after that terrifying experience at Mount Sinai?
Exactly. Just before this verse in Deuteronomy, the text recounts how the Israelites were, frankly, petrified at Sinai. The fire, the thunder, the sheer overwhelming presence of God is too much. They basically pleaded with Moses, saying, look, let's not hear God's voice directly or see this fire anymore, or we're actually going to die.
So they asked for a mediator.
They did, and the promise of this prophet, the one like me, is presented as God's direct answer to that fear. They couldn't handle the direct divine interface, so God says, okay, I'll raise up a human mediator for you, someone from among your own brothers. This prophet would speak God's words, but in a way they could handle, human conduit. And right away, that frames Moses' own primary role, doesn't it? He was already that guy standing between God and the people.
That makes sense. He was the interface. So that leads us to thinking about the specific things Moses did, the roles he filled that set the pattern, the template for this future prophet. Because it wasn't just about being a good speaker, was it?
No, not at all. The source argues it had to be much deeper than that. The prophet had to essentially replicate or, well, fulfill three monumental responsibilities that Moses pioneered.
Okay, what are they?
Well, the first one, as we just touched on, is the role of intercession. Moses was the ultimate go-between, the advocate. Think about that golden calf incident, a total disaster. The people completely blew it, and God, in his anger, was ready to just wipe them out and start over with Moses.
Yeah, that was intense.
And Moses just throws himself into the breach. He argues, he pleads, he negotiates with God for forgiveness for the people. He's like their defense attorney before the divine court. That role, intercession, standing in the gap, mediating forgiveness, it was absolutely central to who Moses was for Israel.
Okay, intercessor. That's number one. What's the second?
The second is tied very closely to that. He was the lawgiver. Moses didn't just lead them. He delivered the covenant, the law itself, from God. This law was foundational. It defined who Israel was supposed to be as a people, what their relationship with God and each other should look like. It set this incredibly high, unbending standard of righteousness.
And that lawgiver role, it's interesting. It kind of cuts both ways, doesn't it? It gives them the blueprint for life, yeah. But by defining what's right, it automatically defines what's wrong. It highlights sin.
Absolutely. It provides the standard and almost immediately shows humanity's inability to consistently meet that standard, which in turn creates this tension, this need. A need that only a greater intercessor, maybe, could ultimately resolve.
Okay, so intercessor, lawgiver. What's the third defining role?
The third is perhaps the one he's most famous for historically, the deliverer. Moses led the people physically out of slavery in Egypt, geopolitical bondage. He was the one associated with the signs and wonders, the plagues, parting the Red Sea, all aimed at securing their physical freedom. That he guided them through the wilderness, helped find water, mediated the manna. He was their rescuer, their guide.
So intercessor, lawgiver, deliverer, those are the big three.
That's what the source material argues, yes. And the claim is, when Moses prophesied a prophet like me, he was essentially saying, look at these three pillars of my ministry, the one coming after me. He has to match or even exceed me in all three. Moses' life became the mold.
And the prophet to come would fill that mold, but the source suggests on a different scale.
Exactly, on a spiritual and eternal scale. The structure would be similar, but the substance and scope would be vastly greater.
Okay, that framework makes a lot of sense. But hang on. If you're an ancient Israelite hearing this, how do you avoid getting fooled? Surely after Moses, other leaders popped up claiming to be deliverers or speaking for God. How do they know who the real prophet like Moses was supposed to be?
That's a really important practical question, and the source material acknowledges it. The law itself, the one Moses delivered, actually included tests for identifying false prophets. If their predictions didn't come true, or if they tried to lead people away from God towards other gods, they were to be rejected. That was the immediate safeguard.
Okay, so there were tests.
Yes. But the ultimate validation, the confirmation that this specific prophecy was fulfilled by one specific person, well, that comes much, much later. And this is where the source pivots and brings in the New Testament evidence.
Right. This is where it moves from interpretation to an explicit claim by the person believed to be the fulfillment. We're talking about Jesus, specifically in the Gospel of John.
Precisely. John chapter 5, verse 46. Jesus is in a direct confrontation with the religious leaders of his day, people who revered Moses and the law above all else. And in that context, Jesus makes this incredibly bold statement. He says, if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me.
Wow, that's not subtle. He's not just saying Moses' writings support his teachings generally.
No, it's much more direct. He's claiming Moses, the founder of their faith, wrote specifically about him. This statement, according to the source, is the linchpin. It confirms the idea that the Deuteronomy prophecy wasn't just some vague hope, but an intentional, targeted prediction that Jesus himself understood as referring directly to him.
Okay, so if we accept that claim, the whole conversation shifts, doesn't it? It's not about finding accidental similarities anymore.
Right. The argument becomes that Moses' life wasn't just historically significant, it was divinely architected to be the prophetic template for Jesus.
Which means we absolutely have to look closely at those specific parallels the source material highlights, the structural similarities.
Exactly. If Moses was the template, the proof, or at least the strong evidence, has to be in the details, not just the big themes. The source lays out, I think, 4 really specific and quite striking parallels between the life story and mission of Moses and Jesus. The argument is these aren't just coincidences, they're prophecy being fulfilled point by point.
Okay, let's walk through them. Where does the source start?
Right at the beginning. Parallel 1, perilous births and state-sponsored slaughter.
Okay. Moses' birth story is pretty famous.
It is. He was born during a horrific time. Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, was apparently terrified of the growing Hebrew slave population. He felt they were becoming too numerous, too powerful, a potential threat. So he issued this brutal decree: kill all newborn male Hebrew infants. Genocide, basically. Moses only survived because his mother hid him, then placed him in a waterproof basket, an ark, among the reeds of the Nile. It was a miraculous escape, really, and it immediately sets him apart as someone marked, someone who was already a threat to the powers that be just by existing.
And the parallel with Jesus, it's almost eerily similar, isn't it?
It really is. Jesus wasn't born under Pharaoh, obviously, but under Herod the Great, who was known for his paranoia and ruthlessness, especially concerning threats to his throne. When the Magi arrived from the east asking about the birth of the King of the Jews, Herod, according to the Gospel of Matthew, felt deeply threatened politically. His response: he ordered the massacre of all male infants 2 years old and under Bethlehem and the surrounding area. It's the same pattern. State-sanctioned infanticide aimed at eliminating a perceived threat embodied in a newborn deliverer.
Wow, so the source isn't just saying they both had rough starts, it's highlighting this specific element of targeted official murder of babies.
Yes, that's the crucial shared element the source emphasizes. The immediate deadly opposition from the ruling geopolitical power at the moment of the deliverer's arrival. The argument is, this isn't random. It establishes a recurring theme in this cosmic struggle. The forces opposing God's plan recognized the threat instantly, whether it was in ancient Egypt or first century Judea.
It certainly sets a dramatic tone. A deliverer born under the shadow of death. Okay, that's parallel 1. What's next? Does it connect to Egypt again?
It does, but in a slightly unexpected way. This brings us to parallel 2, deliverance and the Egypt connection. Moses, famously, led Israel out of Egypt. Egypt symbolized slavery, oppression.
Right, the Exodus is the defining event. But Jesus, didn't he go into Egypt?
He did, and that's the nuance here. It seems like the reverse, doesn't it? When Herod issued his decree, Joseph was warned in a dream, and the family fled to Egypt for safety. They stayed there until Herod died, and only then did they return to Israel.
So Moses leads people out of the land of bondage. Jesus is led into the symbolic land of bondage for safety before he can even begin his work. How does the source reconcile that?
The source material tackles this apparent inversion by looking at the thematic continuity rather than just the geography. For Moses, Egypt was the literal place of physical slavery, and his mission was about physical liberation from that place. For Jesus, the source argues, fleeing into Egypt connects him symbolically to that same history of bondage and oppression. He enters the land of slavery, survives the threat there, and then comes out again, positioned now to eventually lead people out of a much deeper spiritual slavery.
Okay. So it's like Egypt is still the pivot point, but the meaning shifts. Moses had to get out of Egypt to start his confrontation with Pharaoh. Jesus goes to Egypt to survive, then comes out to eventually confront the ultimate Pharaoh, sin and death itself.
That's the idea. The template is reused, but upgraded. The prophet, like Moses, still has this significant connection to Egypt, the place of deliverance, but the nature of the deliverance he brings is fundamentally different, broader, more spiritual. The physical points to the spiritual.
Okay, I can see that. It maintains the pattern while elevating the meaning. That leads nicely into the next parallel, doesn't it? Dealing with needs in the wilderness. Parallel 3, sustenance in the wilderness.
Yes. After leading Israel out of Egypt, Moses faced this incredible challenge for 40 years, keeping potentially millions of people alive in a barren desert. A key part of that was mediating the miracle of manna.
Bread from heaven.
Literally, according to the text, bread that rained down from the sky every day except the Sabbath. It was their physical sustenance, a direct sign of God's provision. Without it, they wouldn't have survived the journey.
But the source material probably emphasizes the limitations of manna, right?
Exactly. It was miraculous, yes, but it was temporary. It only sustained physical life for that day. If you tried to hoard it, it would spoil. It got them through the desert, but it couldn't give them eternal life or solve their deeper spiritual needs. It was fundamentally physical and temporal.
So how does Jesus fulfill and surpass this aspect of the prophet like Moses is?
Well, this is where Jesus makes one of his most famous I am statements, directly referencing the manna event. In the Gospel of John, chapter 6, after feeding the 5,000, another bread miracle, notice the crowds are asking for a sign like the manna Moses gave, and Jesus' response is profound. He contrasts the manna their ancestors ate in the wilderness and still died with himself. He declares, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty.
He takes the historical event and basically says, that was the shadow, I am the reality.
Precisely. Moses mediated physical bread from heaven. Jesus claims to be the spiritual bread of life, the ultimate provision from heaven. Manna sustained a temporary physical life. Jesus offers eternal spiritual life.
So the parallel is in the role, provider of supernatural sustenance from God. But the contrast shows the vast difference in the nature of the gift, temporal versus eternal.
Yes, it demonstrates, the source argues, that the later prophet wasn't just repeating history, he was fulfilling its ultimate purpose. He was the necessary divine upgrade to the pattern Moses established.
It's a powerful point. The similarities establish the connection, the like me part, while the differences establish the superiority, the need for this greater prophet. And that seems to lead perfectly into the fourth parallel, which you mentioned earlier has a kind of tragic element to it.
It does. This is parallel 4, the boundary and the goal, the promised land analogy.
Moses' ending.
Yes, it's one of the most poignant moments in the Old Testament. After everything, delivering the people, guiding them, giving them the law, enduring their complaints for 40 years, Moses himself is forbidden from entering the promised land.
Because of one specific mistake, right, hitting the rock instead of speaking to it.
That's the incident cited in the text, a moment of disobedience, of perhaps taking God's glory for himself. And the consequence was severe. He was allowed to climb Mount Nebo, look out across the Jordan River and see the land, see the fulfillment of the promise from afar, but he couldn't cross over. He died there, on the boundary.
Now, the source material argues this isn't just a sad historical detail about Moses' personal failure. It says this limitation acts as a metaphor.
A physical metaphor for the limitation of the very law that Moses carried. That's the argument.
How does that work?
Think about it. The delivered by Moses, perfectly defines the path to righteousness, the way to live in the promised land of God's blessing and fellowship. It shows the destination, the standard. But, and this is critical, the law itself provides no inherent power to meet that standard perfectly, nor does it contain within itself the ultimate solution for failing to meet the standard. It can diagnose the problem, sin, but it can't provide the cure, grace, forgiveness, enabling power.
So just like Moses could only lead the people to the edge of the land but couldn't bring them in.
The law he carried could only point the way towards righteousness and salvation, but couldn't actually get anyone there on its own merit. It served its vital purpose, revealing God's standard, revealing sin, but it was ultimately limited.
Wow. So Moses' personal failure at the border becomes symbolic of the law's inherent limitation.
Exactly. He embodies the law's function and its boundary. He could point to the goal, just like the law points to God's perfect standard and the need for redemption, but something more, something beyond the law, was needed to actually cross over.
Which means the prophet, like Moses, had to be the one who could succeed, where Moses, and by analogy the law, ultimately fell short.
Precisely. Moses' tragic limitation at the very threshold underscores the need for a greater deliverer, one who could not only point the way, but actually provide the entry. The law pointed ahead. The greater prophet had to be the one to complete the journey, bringing people into the true promised land, not just of geography, but of relationship with God.
The law identifies the problem, the prophet provides the solution.
That's a succinct way to put it, yes. The law, in a sense, creates the demand, the awareness of the need, that only the figure of Jesus fulfilling Moses' template, but transcending the law's limitation, could ultimately satisfy.
Okay, so we've looked at these incredibly detailed structural parallels. Now let's zoom out a bit. What's the bigger theological picture the source material draws from all this? If Moses was intentionally this blueprint, what does that tell us about the overall plan?
Well, the major conclusion the source emphasizes is this. God's plan for salvation, centered on Jesus, wasn't some kind of emergency measure. It wasn't Plan B, cobbled together after Adam and Eve failed, or after Israel failed.
It was the plan all along.
That's the core insight. If Moses, who stands near the beginning of Israel's national story, the foundational figure, was already a deliberate foreshadowing, it implies the architecture of redemption was established from very early on, perhaps even from the beginning. You can see it, the source argues, as this continuous thread. It runs from Moses, the deliverer lawgiver template, through figures like David, who provides the kingly template, and then the later prophets who add dimensions like the suffering servant, all converging, all pointing consistently towards Jesus. These parallels aren't random echoes. They're evidence of a single, unfolding, preordained narrative.
So Jesus wasn't just reacting to history. He was fulfilling a design that history itself was built around.
That's the perspective offered, yes. And seeing that intentional structure makes the differences between Moses and Jesus even more significant. We've touched on this, but they were alike in their roles and structure, yet their ultimate authority and, crucially, the gifts they brought were profoundly different.
Which brings us back squarely to that essential contrast, law versus grace.
Exactly. Moses gave the law. We've established what it does, defines sin, sets God's perfect standard, reveals our inability to meet it, and therefore shows our need for rescue. The law is good, wholly just, but we are not.
It's like holding up a perfect mirror, isn't it?
That's a common and helpful analogy theologians use. A mirror shows you every speck of dirt, every flaw, with perfect accuracy. It performs its function perfectly.
But the mirror can't wash your face.
Precisely. It reveals the problem, but offers no solution in itself. The prophet, like Moses, the greater prophet, had to bring the cleansing, the solution. And that, in the source's view, is grace.
So Moses gives the law, which diagnoses. Jesus gives grace, which cures.
In essence, yes. Grace, as presented here, is God's unmerited favor. It's the divine power enabling believers to move towards meeting the standard. And crucially, it's the forgiveness, the covering, offered when inevitably fail. Moses laid down the requirement. Jesus provided both the path to fulfillment and the pardon for falling short. This shift from requirement to provision is the absolute heart of why the prophet had to be superior.
And this upgrade in the gift from law to grace is mirrored in the problem being addressed, right? The scope is different. Egypt versus sin.
Yes, absolutely. Moses was without question an incredible deliverer in his own right. Think about the scale of the Exodus, leading potentially millions out of a superpower, crossing a sea, surviving a desert. It was a monumental feat of physical and geopolitical liberation. Moses solved the problem of national slavery under a specific human tyrant.
But that kind of slavery, terrible as it is limited. It's physical, it's temporal, it's confined to a place and time.
Exactly. And the source material argues that this physical slavery in Egypt was always intended as a picture, a type, a shadow of the much deeper universal bondage that traps every human being, the bondage of sin.
Sin as the ultimate form of slavery.
Yes, a spiritual slavery, an internal bondage that leads to eternal consequences. It's not limited by geography or time, it affects everyone. And if the bondage is spiritual and universal, the deliverer needed must also operate in that spiritual, universal, even divine level.
So Moses could lead Israel out of Egypt.
But only Jesus, the greater prophet, operating with divine authority and offering grace, could lead humanity out of the dominion of sin. The scale of the problem dictates the necessary scale of the solution, and thus the nature of the deliverer.
It brings it all together. He had to be like Moses to fit the established pattern, showing continuity with God's plan. But he had to be greater than Moses, offering grace, not just law, and defeating sin, not just Pharaoh, to actually accomplish the ultimate eternal deliverance that the pattern pointed towards.
Well said. The lawgiver points beyond himself to the need for a grace giver. The physical deliverer points beyond himself to the need for a spiritual, eternal deliverer.
And that transition is key. Moses was human, mortal. His leadership ended, his body stayed on Mount Nebo, his power was mediated, limited.
Right. And the prophet, who brings spiritual bread, who opens the way to eternal life, who conquers sin and death, that prophet, the source contends, must necessarily transcend human limitations, must transcend death itself. The very nature of the ultimate problem, sin, death, spiritual bondage, demands a divine deliverer.
So looking back at our deep dive, the source material isn't just listing coincidences. It's building this highly structured, almost architectural case. Moses' life, his roles, even his limitations were all part of a divine construction project, building signposts pointing down through the centuries.
Yes, every parallel, the dangerous birth, the Egypt connection, the bread, the boundary, is presented as validation of the prophetic link. And every contrast, law versus grace, temporal versus eternal deliverance, is presented as validation for why the prophet had to be not just like Moses, but infinitely greater. #OuttrackHow.
Well, this has been a really fascinating and incredibly detailed look into that Deuteronomic prophecy and its implications. Just to quickly recap for everyone listening, we started with Moses' own words in Deuteronomy 18:15, predicting a prophet like me. And we saw how Moses himself established the template through his key roles: intercessor, lawgiver, and deliverer.
Yeah, and then we trace the specific fulfillments argued by the source material, those four structural parallels. The shared danger at birth, the critical role of Egypt even in reverse, the massive upgrade from manna to the bread of life.
And that poignant contrast between Moses being stopped at the boundary of the promised land and Jesus being the one who grants entry into the true eternal promised land.
And anchoring it all was Jesus' own claim back in John 5:46, saying essentially, yes, Moses was writing about me. The parallels show the continuity, the contrasts show the necessity of the upgrade.
The similarities prove the lineage, you could say, while the differences prove why that lineage had to culminate in someone far greater, moving from law to grace, from freedom from Egypt to freedom from sin.
Exactly. And the source material doesn't just leave it there as a historical or theological exercise. It really turns the focus back towards us, towards the listener. It poses a pretty profound question, really. If Moses himself, this giant of faith, the most revered figure in Israel's history, knew his own work was incomplete, knew someone greater was coming after him, and specifically commanded the people to listen to him, well, what does that mean for us, living after this promised prophet has supposedly arrived?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Moses told the people back then, you must listen to him. The command wasn't just for them, it echoes down through time. The source really leaves us asking, not just, was Jesus the prophet Moses predicted, but assuming he was,
are we actually listening? Are we heeding the words of the one Moses himself pointed to?
It reframes everything. The law, the prophets, the whole sweep of that history wasn't just about itself. It was this long, meticulous preparation pointing forward.
Preparing the world for the message and the deliverer.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with today, something to really chew on from all this, is this. If Moses saw him coming, if his life was the blueprint, if the law itself cried out for this greater fulfillment through grace, what specific word from Jesus, the prophet Moses, told us to listen to, are you perhaps ignoring or obeying today? That's the question that this deep dive leaves echoing.